right, let's go ahead and get started. I'm Karen Hansen-Kuhn. I'm Director of Trade and International Strategies at the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy. I'll be moderating the webinar today. So welcome to the webinar on science, regulation, and human health, justifications for Mexico's GM corn restrictions. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few sort of housekeeping issues on how we'll run the webinar. Can you move to the next slide? Okay, there we go. This webinar will have simultaneous interpretation between Spanish and English. So at the bottom of your screen, you will see an interpretation button. It looks like a globe. So este es un webinario bilingüe, así que en los controles del webinario, en la barra en la parte inferior de la pantalla, puede hacer clic en el botón Interpretación en forma de globo. Click the language that you would like to hear, English or Spanish. Haga clic en el idioma que desea escuchar, es decir, inglés o español. And if you'd like to hear the interpreted language only, click Mute Audio. Otherwise, you'll hear the original language softly in the background. So, para oír solo el idioma interpretado, haga clic en Silenciar audio original. De lo contrario, oirá el idioma original suavemente de fondo. Okay, so I hope people can use the interpretation button. We have excellent translation today. So also at the bottom, you'll see the Q&A button with a question mark. Please ask questions of the presenters at any point during the webinar by typing your question into the Q&A box and then hit send. We'll get to as many of the questions as we can at the end of the webinar. We will not be looking in the chat function for questions, so please do put your questions in the Q&A button. We are recording this webinar. Afterwards, we will post it on IATP's website, and we will circulate it to people, everyone who registered or attended the webinar. That'll be probably within a week. And finally, this is the first of 3 webinars focused on the corn dispute between the United States and Mexico. We hope you will join us on May 2nd for a webinar on biodiversity and cultural rights implications of the USMCA text and GMO corn case, and then on May 7th for the economics, farmers' livelihoods and perspectives. We have some great speakers today. I'm just going to give a few words of context about what this dispute is about. The Mexican government announced its plans to transition away from GM corn and glyphosate at the beginning of President Andrés Manuel López Obrador's office when he took office in 2019. These plans were not made in isolation. They're part of a bigger series of reforms designed to increase food self-sufficiency in Mexico and to transition towards agroecological production. The initial decree called for phasing out the use of glyphosate and of imports of GM corn by 2024. A revised decree was issued in February of 2023. In the new decree, it calls for the continued phase out of glyphosate over time and will eliminate the use of GM corn in flour and tortillas and other uses for direct human consumption. It also calls for the eventual substitution of GM corn for industrial use and animal feed as non-GM corn becomes available over time. The U.S. launched a formal trade dispute against these plans in August under the rules of the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA, known as CUSMA in Canada and TEMEC in Mexico. They assert that the Mexican government's actions violate sanitary and phytosanitary standards, that is, rules on plant and food safety. They say the agreements were not based on international standards and that they discriminate against U.S. exports. Even though it does not export corn to Mexico, Canada joined the complaint as a third party. The dispute is ongoing, and we expect that a decision will be made by the end of this year. The organizations involved in this webinar have each made formal written submissions in the official dispute process, or in some cases, they tried and were denied, such as our friends in Canada. But we've all made detailed analyses of the issues involved in this case. This first webinar will focus on the science and regulatory issues around GM corn safety for human health. We have 4 speakers. Our first speaker is Chuck Benbrook. Chuck is the principal of Benbrook Consulting Services and the co-author with Friends of the Earth of an official submission on the USMCA corn dispute. He is an agricultural economist, pesticide litigation consultant, and former adjunct professor with the Center for Sustaining Agriculture and Natural Resources at Washington State University. Chuck was also the scientific advisor for the Organic Industry Research Organization, the Organic Center, from 2004 to June 2012. He holds a bachelor's degree in economics from Harvard University, as well as an MA and a PhD in agricultural economics from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So Chuck, please go ahead.
Thank you, Karen, and IATP for the invitation to participate in this webinar. Kendra Klein and I co-authored a 10-page comment to the tribunal following the rules set forth. Our comments cover a lot of science and several issues and are available via the Friends of the Earth website, as well as the IATP website in both English and Spanish. And for those who want to pursue the science supporting what I'm going to cover today, please go to those 10-page comments, because I can't possibly cover it all in 10 minutes. The context in Mexico that we highlight in the beginning is that a number of measures of public health in Mexico are going in a negative direction, particularly obesity, diabetes, and kidney disease. It's quite clear that a majority of these metabolic chronic diseases have their roots in changes in the diet. Ultra-processed foods, often from the United States, has become widely available and regularly consumed in Mexico, and has driven these worrisome trends in public health in Mexico, much as they have in the United States. So in a way, the reaction and response to this dispute in Mexico, it is certainly concerned about the additional impacts, negative impacts on public health that might arise were genetically engineered corn to become widely planted and ubiquitously used in masa and tortillas. Our comments focus primarily on the modern genetically engineered corn varieties that are being grown in the United States and around the world, and would be the go-to varieties in Mexico if the United States prevails on this, and Mexico has to fully open its doors to genetically engineered corn. There's a useful resource available called the Handy Trait Table. It's compiled by U.S. academics, and it lists the herbicide tolerant and insect control traits in the most widely sold varieties of genetically engineered corn in the United States. Of these 49 varieties, all of them include one or more herbicide tolerant traits. A few have only glyphosate resistance. 38 have glyphosate and glufosinate, a second herbicide, and 4 have been genetically engineered to withstand applications of up to 10 herbicides, glyphosate, glufosinate, 2,4-D, and a family of chemistry referred to as the FOPs or FOP. So based on the traits that are in the market today, approximately 2.5 or 3 different herbicide traits are in each variety. In terms of the insect control traits, there are 16 traits that express 1 or 2 BT or VIP, which stands for vegetative integrated proteins in the trait, and then 14 that express 3, and so on, with 9 expressing 6 or 7 different traits. In the United States, the modern and most heavily marketed corn varieties fall in this category of 4 to 7 traits. So by our calculations, the average GM corn being grown in North America now expresses about 4.5 different BT or VIP traits. This is very important because when genetically engineered corn and in particular BT corn came on the market, most of the varieties expressed a single trait or at most 2 traits. In addition, those single or dual traits expressed between 2 parts per million and 6 parts per million of the BT VIP endotoxins in the kernel of corn. And of course, that's what we're concerned about, because it's the kernel of corn from which cornmeal and masa and tortillas would be manufactured. These modern varieties, however, that are expressing 4 to 7 traits typically express between 50 and 100 parts per million of BT VIP endotoxins in the kernel. So it's a very substantial increase in the expression level of the proteins. Why are such higher levels in modern corn? Because it takes more BT and VIP endotoxin to kill the target insects, because of the progressive development of first tolerance and then resistance to the underlying BT and VIP proteins. This is a very worrisome characteristic of BT technology in all engineered crops, that over time it takes more of them and higher levels of expression to kill the insects. And of course, these higher levels of expression substantially increase the potential human health risks. Now, why are we concerned about this? Why is the Mexican government concerned about these proteins, endotoxin proteins that are being expressed in the corn, as well as the use of glyphosate? So research in Mexico shows very clearly that there will be simultaneous exposure to multiple BT and VIP endotoxins in corn-based foods, which constitute some 60% of the caloric intake in the Mexican diet, as well as a significant percent will carry herbicide residue. So the food safety concern and public health concern that has to be on the mind of the tribunal is, what is the combined impact of these BT VIP proteins and multiple herbicide residues appearing in such a common food in Mexico, which makes up a part of most of the meals to one extent or another. The scientific literature is full of recent high-quality papers linking increased exposure to herbicides to adverse public health outcomes, reproductive outcomes, children's development outcomes, and in a way most concerning, adverse impacts on the stomach and GI tract, and chronic diseases that fall under the rubric of metabolic syndrome. So that would be overweight and obesity and diabetes and heart disease and stroke. of course, it's this suite of metabolic syndrome diseases that kill most people. Recent research has been published that documents significant disruption in the human GI tract, and in particular in the upper and lower intestines, as a result of exposures to relatively low levels of glyphosate and 2,4-D in particular. And I just want to drive home that the point that it is an absolutely certain that a vast majority of citizens in North America, Canada, US, and Mexico are exposed on a near daily basis to both glyphosate and 2,4-D. Long-term testing in the United States shows that essentially 100% of the US population is exposed to 2,4-D. There is a very important paper moving through the peer review process now that reports significant synergy between glyphosate and 2,4-D in triggering adverse impacts on the human GI tract, and in particular the upper and lower intestines. The degree to which the GI tract of people in North America have been and are being disrupted by both BT and VIP proteins and herbicide residues in food, in beverages, is simply not known. It has not been a topic given any research attention by the US government through any of its research programs. The work that has been done and published in high quality peer-reviewed journals, much of it has come from Mexico, much from Europe, and some from Asia and Brazil. A recent paper based on the massive increase in planting of Roundup Ready or genetically engineered soybeans in Brazil reports a troubling increase in cases and deaths from pediatric leukemia, primarily, according to the authors, linked to the increased use of herbicides in the growing of genetically engineered soybeans. The question before the tribunal is, has the US government in its submissions and in its research provided to the tribunal sufficient and convincing data on the potential human health impacts of these modern varieties? And unfortunately, the answer is no. There has been very little new and modern research on these varieties. And what little research has been done has basically focused on whether the varieties would impair the growth of cattle, the production of milk by cows, or the performance of pigs and chickens. There have been no long-term impacts of what the impacts of these herbicide residues in food in conjunction with BT and VIP proteins over a long lifetime like that of a human. And we hope that the tribunal will pay considerable attention to this new and emerging scientific evidence. Thank you.
Thank you, Chuck. That's excellent. The written comments we have all made are available. We can maybe send around links when we send the follow-up email. Our next speaker is Bill Freese. Bill is the Science Director for the Center for Food Safety, a nonprofit organization that supports sustainable agriculture and opposes harmful food production technologies. Bill has written and lectured extensively on the regulation of genetically engineered crops and associated pesticides, as well as their human health and environmental impacts. Bill? I think you need to turn on your video.
Okay, great. Thank you, Karen, for that introduction. And yeah, let me share my screen here. Okay, can folks, oh, wait. Okay, Can folks see the screen, I guess?
Looks great, Bill.
Okay, great. Yeah, again, I'm the science director for Center for Food Safety, and we've been involved in GMO regulation for many years now. And as Kieran said, our mission is to protect the public from hazardous agricultural technologies. And we focused a lot of attention on GMO and pesticides. And I published a paper a while ago on the US regulatory system. So it's one of our specialties. So I think Chuck covered what GMOs are. They're basically two types. One is corn and cotton that have toxins that kill insects. And the other are crops that are genetically engineered to be resistant to herbicides such as glyphosate. And I'll just mention that we hear a lot about GMOs increasing yields and having better nutrition. And in fact, that's simply not the case. These are at most experiments, most of which fail. These are the two traits, insect and herbicide resistance, that make up all of the world of genetically engineered crops. So why do we need regulation? And I think it's pretty clear that this radical new technology of genetic engineering, it poses, potential risks that need to be evaluated very carefully. For instance, the introduction of new toxins or allergens. And the government really should serve as the honest broker to assess those risks, and then take action as needed to either restrict or even prohibit certain GMOs if they are hazardous. Unfortunately, our government does not have a regulatory system that fulfills that mission. And this is an excerpt from a really excellent New York Times article from 2001, where it was revealed to what extent the biotechnology industry designed our whole regulatory system. It's really pretty scandalous. This is just one quote about the degree to which, especially the Monsanto company, determined our whole regulatory structure for GMOs. And so the purpose of our GMO regulation is not to ensure food safety, as a lot of people think. This is the title of an article on our Food and Drug Administration's website, right, the FDA. And you can see that they say very upfront that the purpose of our regulatory system is to ease the pathway to marketplace for GMOs, right? So the whole idea is to reassure people, have a governmental rubber stamp to make people feel comfortable about eating GMOs, not to actually ensure food safety. And this is unfortunate because, FDA scientists, right, when you talk to FDA scientists, they do admit that there are human health risks from GMOs. And this is not a complete list by any means, but this is, something that is, acknowledged even by the scientists at FDA. And I think this is a very important point. The regulatory system in the US is voluntary. Okay, so what that means is that someone who develops a GMO, say Monsanto or other company, does not have to go to FDA to get approval. It's a voluntary system, a consultation program. And if you look at the US-Mexico-Canada agreement, it defines regulation as being mandatory, right? So what this says is that US GMO regulation is not compliant with the US-Mexico-Canada agreement. So in a consultation, so when a company chooses to consult with the FDA, they almost never do actual animal feeding trials with the genetically engineered crop. They normally just measure the levels of certain plant components, such as proteins and vitamins and minerals. And then FDA says upfront, we do not conduct a comprehensive scientific review of this data. So at the end of a consultation, right, FDA sends the company a letter, okay? And this is one example of a letter that FDA sent to Monsanto regarding a Monsanto genetically modified corn. And basically, FDA puts the responsibility for food safety on the company, okay? It is Monsanto's responsibility to ensure that this GM corn is safe. Well, Monsanto, in turn, says, no, it's not our job to ensure safety. It's FDA's job, right? This is a Monsanto executive quoted in an article from a while ago. So basically, no one vouches for the safety of GM food, not FDA and not the company. So our US Department of Agriculture, under rules that were passed in 2020, now exempts most GMOs from any government oversight. This was a regulatory relief initiative. And companies can even make their own determination to determine that their GMOs are not regulated. So what we have in the US is basically a Wild West for GMOs. And one example of what can happen without regulation is a corn variety known as Enogen, which was developed specifically for ethanol production. It contains high levels of an enzyme that converts cornstarch into sugar. And it takes only one kernel of this biofuels corn mixed with 10,000 kernels of food corn to ruin that corn for food use. And in fact, we've seen massive contamination. This Enogen corn has contaminated white corn in Nebraska very widely, causing farmers to lose their harvests because of this Enogen contamination. And there have been examples too where this contaminated corn is turned into food and turned into masa flour. For instance, a batch that was sold by a market in Los Angeles. Well, customers who made tamales from this corn said were outraged because they were gooey, they fell apart, and they even reportedly made some people sick. And this is an example. There's a video I would encourage you to check out that shows just how bad the situation was. This is what just even very low-level contamination with this corn will do. Now, Chuck mentioned the insect-resistant GM corn, and this is corn that contains toxins derived from a soil bacterium, and it's known as Bt corn. So some of these Bt toxins have properties of proteins that cause food allergies, okay? And this has been recognized since the 1990s. And expert advisors told EPA about this very early on. Unfortunately, EPA hasn't taken steps to remove these Bt corn varieties from the market, even though they could be causing allergic reactions. Also, we have herbicide-resistant GM crops that Chuck mentioned, the best known of which are resistant to glyphosate or Roundup. And these crops have been widely planted and they've dramatically increased glyphosate use. And you can see, especially on soybeans in green and corn on yellow and cotton in red, how much glyphosate is now being used, nearly 300 million pounds per year. So in order to facilitate the introduction of this Roundup Ready corn, the EPA raised the maximum permissible residue of glyphosate on corn, okay? And it used to be just 0.1 parts per million, and then it was raised to 1 part per million, and in 2008, all the way to 5 parts per million. And this is because when you spray Roundup directly on corn that's resistant to it, you tend to get higher residue levels. And so again, EPA raised the residue level for glyphosate by 50 fold since the 1980s. And I think that should be of concern to us because glyphosate has been classified as probably carcinogenic to humans by the world's leading cancer specialists of the World Health Organization, and it's associated particularly with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Many Roundup users in the United States have won lawsuits against Monsanto and Bayer because the Roundup was a factor in their cancer. And my organization, Center for Food Safety, sued EPA over this. And the federal court agreed with us that EPA's health assessment of glyphosate was just faulty and actually struck down that health assessment because EPA denied that glyphosate causes cancer, but at the same time inconsistently said that it might cause non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. EPA once conceded that glyphosate also had adverse effects on the liver and the kidney, but now denies that this is the case and has raised the safe level of human exposure, supposedly safe level of human exposure, by 20-fold. It used to be 0.05, and now it is 1.0 milligrams per kilogram per day. So in conclusion, I think we really need to, the tribunal needs to understand that US so-called regulation of GMOs is simply not compliant with the US-Mexico-Canada agreement. It's voluntary, not mandatory. We have GMO contamination of white maize that ruins masa corn products, and there might be many other GMO corn varieties out there that we don't even know about. Insect-resistant Bt corn toxins might cause food allergies, and glyphosate is linked to cancer, liver, and kidney disease. So in the end, I think it's clear that Mexico cannot rely on US government assurances about the safety of GMOs and glyphosate, and the tribunal needs to understand this and not accept US claims to the contrary. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. I want to thank the first two speakers for these very clear presentations. Our first two speakers were from the United States. Our next speaker is from Canada. Lucy Sharratt works as the coordinator of the Canadian Biotechnology Action Network, also known as CBAN. CBAN brings together 15 groups to research, monitor, and raise awareness about issues relating to genetic engineering in food and farming. CBAN members include farmer associations, environmental and social justice organizations, and regional coalitions of grassroots groups. Lucy previously worked as a campaigner and researcher on this issue at the Sierra Club of Canada and the Polaris Institute in Ottawa. Lucy, please go ahead.
Thank you. Great, you can see my slides?
Yes.
Great, thank you. In my short presentation, I would like to highlight 3 arguments that follow from the information presented by Chuck and Bill. They also respond to arguments made by both the United States and Canadian governments in their submissions to the Trade Dispute Panel. My slides include quotes from the Canadian government's submission. These quotes, these arguments mirror statements made by the US government also in their submission. So firstly, the US and Canadian governments infer that their safety assessments mean that GM corn is safe. We argue that government risk assessments do not ensure safety. They are not guarantor of safety. GM corn approvals have been granted with what we would argue is insufficient science and incomplete examination, and further ongoing monitoring for potential adverse health impacts is necessary, but it's not being done in North America. Unlike in the US, as Bill has described, the Canadian regulatory assessments for GM corn are mandatory, except for new exemptions for most categories of gene-edited foods and crops. But Canadian regulation has similar limitations and structure to US regulation. In particular, as Bill has highlighted in the US case, Canadian regulatory decisions to approve GM corn are based on confidential data packages submitted by product developers themselves. These packages may or may not actually include data as we might expect. Certainly, and Bill also mentioned this, in Canada, there's no requirement that product developers submit animal feeding test data, for example. While the public and independent scientists cannot see inside these packages of information, from what we know in the Canadian experience, there are at least 4 cases where GM corn events have been approved, where animal feeding tests were published in the peer-reviewed literature years after those product approvals. In the case of Monsanto's GM corn numbered NK 603, this was 10 years after product approval. And so this argument that government risk assessments cannot be considered the final statement on safety is validated also by the continued and repeated recent publication of studies in the literature that show harm of Bt to non-target insects. Mostly these studies are in the ecological context, though not exclusively, that throw the assumption of Bt specificity under question. Scientific investigation continues and should continue even after approval. Certainly, US and Canadian assessments of GM corn safety do not necessarily transfer readily to an assessment of safety in the Mexican context, which I will also discuss. Secondly, there is no scientific consensus that GM foods are safe. And this is being said now because both the US and Canadian governments make very broad statements about a conclusion of safety internationally that are simply not correct. Scientists themselves have felt compelled to respond to such statements that have been made in other contexts with their own statement of no consensus. For example, over 300 independent scientific researchers and scholars signed a statement of no consensus that was discussed here in this paper in the literature. Critically, as Mexico says, the Mexican government says in its submission to the Trade Dispute Panel, over these 3 decades, according to the scientific literature, there is no scientific consensus on the safety of GM crop consumption, particularly on GM corn. And this argument that Mexico makes is supported in the recent ruling just days ago from the Court of Appeals in the Philippines that has halted the production of genetically modified golden rice and Bt eggplant. That ruling stated that there is a volume of independent study and information presented in the case proceedings, such that possible scenarios of risk could not be ruled out, serious risk could not be ruled out. So this court was very clear that the scientific debates and uncertainties demand an application of the precautionary principle. So we would argue that it's simplistic and incorrect to make such statements as the US and Canada have done about global conclusions of safety. Certainly, the scientific method must continue to investigate and be open to questions. Finally, or thirdly here, and I will quote from the Canadian submission, that Canada considers that Mexico has not considered the long history of safe use of GM corn when adopting its measures. However, there is no long history of safe use of GM corn in the Mexican diet. Specifically, there is no long-term history of use of GM corn in the Mexican diet that relies on the use of minimally processed white corn for tortilla and other traditional foods. This use of corn is entirely different in Mexico from the long history of use of GM corn in processed food ingredients. The United States and Canada appeal to the argument that there is a history of safe use, but this is not the case in Mexico, and that argument for safety has not been verified. So Mexico imports very little white corn. Mexico is largely self-sufficient in the production of white and native corn. This isn't necessarily non-GM corn because there is no cultivation of GM corn allowed in Mexico as one strategy to prevent GM contamination of native corn. So in reality, people in Mexico have not yet been eating a lot of GM corn in their diet, in their tortilla, in their traditional foods. Furthermore, in relation to the use of GM corn, even in processed food ingredients, it's incomplete to state that there is a history of safe use because there is no post-market monitoring to tell us that this use is in fact safe, that it has been safe. This is not a scientifically verified statement. It is an assumption that has not been tested by study. In fact, in Canada, there is no mandatory labeling to enable tracking and tracing for possible adverse health impacts. And the United States has only recently implemented a disclosure law that mandates a form of labeling and tracking of information for only some GM foods. So certainly there is little science to demonstrate a history of safe use of GM corn, and to claim a history of safe use is incorrect in the Mexican context. And we have posted some of our analysis in both English and Spanish. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Lucy. We will be circulating as we've said, the recording as well as the PowerPoints in both languages later. That was also a very clear and excellent presentation. I hope you can see the clapping hands raising up. Our final speaker today is Javier Zúñiga. He is a Mexican lawyer. He holds a law degree from CIDE and an LLM in global health law from Georgetown University Law. His work focuses on the right to health, food law, and human rights. Currently, he works as coordinator of the legal area in El Poder del Consumidor.
Thank you so much. And I will speak in Spanish. I will make my presentation in Spanish. So I'll take a minute while I put my presentation so everybody can switch to the Spanish.
So I hope you can see my slides. Thank you very much for this opportunity. In general, I'd like to share with you my presentation, which is organized in 3 parts. First of all, I'd like to do the legal justification that are the basis for Mexico's decision. And then I'd like to talk about some of the legal arguments that we included in our comment. especially with regard to the right to food and health. So I'd like to begin by speaking of the internal obligations that Mexico has to the population on the right to food, health, and a healthy environment. So the first thing I would like to say, what is the right to health in Mexico? In Mexico, it is the right to food and the right to health is enshrined in the Constitution. This is key because based on this right, we ask if you guarantee the right to food, you have to also guarantee the right to health. And we argue that the right to health doesn't mean just the right to have access to hospitals and doctors, but we argue that it encompasses the right to live in a healthy way. And it includes prevention and very concrete measures as well as information. For example, labeling GMO food so that consumers can decide about the products that they eat and consume. We also understand the right to health to include regulation on health risks and the implementation of the precautionary principle and the preventive principle. It's also important to explain that the right to food is also enshrined in the Constitution, and it's not just a right that means you have the right not to go hungry. It must include an adequate diet and all the nutritional elements that a person needs to lead a healthy and active life. So when we talk about the right of food, we're not just talking about food itself, but production and access and information. Now, the right to a healthy environment, of course, bears on all of this. I'll just highlight a few key points. The state has to take measures to prevent activities that could be risky for the environment. So there's the precautionary principle and there's the preventive principle. The prevention entails the state using all the means at their disposal in order to prevent activities that could cause harm or damage to the environment. So all of this entails establishing a legal framework to guarantee the right to food and the right to a healthy environment and the right to health. Otherwise, the fundamental rights of Mexicans are being violated. So, based on this understanding of the scope of these three rights, we have addressed the issue of GMO corn. We have argued and shown the adverse impacts on human health, on the environment, on the biodiversity, and on food and diet. And this is why the Mexican government has proposed a transition away from the use of GMO corn. And obviously, this has necessarily entailed addressing how the imposition of GMO corn violates trade law. Obviously, free trade is given priority, but it is not without restrictions. For example, the protection of the health of the population and the environment also bears on the obligations contained in the free trade agreement. And we've seen that there are precedents in this regard where Uruguay argued that the health of its population bears on how the free trade agreement is interpreted. Similarly, the health of the population also affects the reading of the trade law. The United States has excellent car emissions standards, but it is deficient in other kinds of protection that have to do with the importation of cars. And obviously, the kind of cars that it allows to be imported is based on the protection of human health. So when we analyzed the Mexican strategy, we saw that it is trying to defend its biodiversity and native species. So the Mexican government is facing some obstacles that are in the USMCA to defend the rights of its population. So the hope is to support the reaching of a solution, and that also entails analyzing the cause and symptoms and the impacts on biodiversity and human health, and also on the natural resources that can be depleted, for example, water or other natural resources that are limited in quantity. So based on the evidence, it's clear that we need to protect native corn because it is threatened by these GMO varieties. So there are key principles of international law that do serve to substantiate Mexican's position. For example, the legitimate objective of GATT Article 20 that states can take measures to protect public morals, human life or health, and public order, as well as the environment. So just in summary, I like to say that there is a basis in the Mexican legal framework that actually makes it necessary for the Mexican government to transition away from GMO corn to protect the right to food, health, and the environment of the population. And that there are exceptions to the obligations under the USMCA because Mexico's obligation to protect these rights of its population come first. So thank you very much for this opportunity. And thank you to all of you.
Thank you so much, Javier. These have been some excellent presentations, and happily, we're a little bit ahead of schedule. So we'll have even more time for questions and answers. So if you have questions, please post them in the Q&A box. That's where I'll be going through. And let's start with a question about the process from Fernando Bejarano. He asks, what is the profile of the people in the tribunal, in the dispute? Panelists will be making these decisions about this challenge. Did they have a background on health or environmental matters? He says, I guess not. So how can they consider whether these impacts are relevant, on what basis under the USMCA regulations, or is there a space to give weight to all of these issues under the actual rules? This is from Fernando Bejarano at Rapam in Mexico. Is there someone who would like to? Okay, Charles, why don't you start?
Great question. I was fascinated too about who these people are, so I spent quite a bit of time tracking down what they do. They are very experienced and seasoned professionals who have devoted this part of their career to serving on just this sort of international tribunal. They have varied backgrounds, but all have deep experience in trade law and international agreements. They have multiple certifications. I think this is a very difficult club, if you will, to get into. And I was really struck by how much many of them have done in the relevant areas. None of them bring a background in public health and agriculture to this tribunal, but they clearly pride themselves on their ability to listen and integrate the information that is put before them. And this is why the comments that several of the NGOs did hopefully will have an impact, because their reputations are based on the degree to which they follow the information and the science in applying the rules of the U.S.-Mexico Free Trade Agreement. So I was quite impressed with them.
Bill, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I actually haven't looked at their backgrounds as Chuck has, but I think that, to the extent that they don't have experience with agriculture or GMOs or pesticides, there is still things that they can look to. And, I'd like to underscore just the fact that the ultimate guarantor of GMO safety, in the United States, and I think in most countries, has to be the governmental agency that is, in charge, or supposed to be in charge. And as, I showed in my presentation, we have, pretty much a deregulatory regime at this point, right? And, as I said, FDA, for instance, does not have mandatory regulation. It's a voluntary system. Companies don't even have to go to FDA. They can just introduce GMOs on their own. So because the USMCA trade agreement, it it defines regulation as being mandatory, right? Which is how we all understand the term. I think the tribunal really needs to take that seriously. In other words, the U.S. system, which is supposedly the guarantor of safety, is voluntary and is not compliant with the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement.
Javier?
I'm going to speak in Spanish. Just as my colleagues are saying, the members of the tribunal are experts in international law, not in agriculture or the environment. So the challenge for them is to take into account how our comments on agriculture and the environment do relate to international law like the GATT. So they need to be able to bridge and integrate our language. Obviously, we're have to take on the challenge of trying to translate our arguments into the language of international law. But I am hopeful, especially based on other cases like the case I cited in Uruguay, where tribunals have heard the testimony of experts in public health, not just on GMOs or exposure to cigarette smoke. Similar experts have become concerned for the impact on human health. So even though they are lawyers and their expertise is international law, I hope they will be open to the
Our
evidence that
next
we
comment
present.
gets back to, or questions about more on the kinds of pesticides and herbicides that are used. So a question from Alexander Martin is that there are various pesticides and herbicides used in Mexico that are potentially dangerous for health, some of which are forbidden in the EU. How do you explain that Mexico's ban focuses only on glyphosate? Yeah, I think we'll just leave it at that. Is there someone who can answer that?
Well, I can take a stab. I can't.
Voy a intentar.
Obviously, I can't explain, the exact thinking of the Mexican government, but glyphosate does have a very high profile because it's used so extensively with GMOs, and there has been a tremendous amount of independent scientific evaluation of glyphosate, more so than many other, pesticides and herbicides. So, I think it's legitimate for Mexico to focus on glyphosate, and given the serious concerns of cancer, liver and kidney problems, and that's not to say that other pesticides, which include herbicides, are not hazardous. So, but yeah, certainly attention to glyphosate is completely justified for Mexico.
Go ahead, Javier.
Yes. What we know about this submission of the Mexican government does confirm what Bill is suggesting. The logic of protecting native corn and what the potential impacts on native corn could be. It's also been a key part of their argument, and also the part of the tortilla, how new rules and standards have been established on how tortilla should be made. So this new framework on tortilla has also shaped the focus of the government of Mexico on glyphosate.
Go ahead, Chuck, while I look
Um,
through some of these other questions.
Karen, this is an important question. Another herbicide called paraquat is still legal and used in Mexico and poses far greater human health risks on a hectare treated to hectare treated basis than glyphosate-based herbicides. Paraquat and glyphosate are used for many of the same purposes in no tillage systems and to burn down weeds prior to planting. Paraquat has been strongly associated with Parkinson's disease and other adverse health impacts. I've brought this concern up with individuals in the Mexican government, and I'm quite sure that they are aware that it would not be a positive outcome of this case to see the banning of glyphosate lead to a large increase in the use of paraquat. That outcome should definitely be prevented by further action by the Mexican government.
All right, I have a question for Lucy, I think. So if Canada's not exporting corn to Mexico, why are they part of this dispute?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I see your question written down too, asking if it's in part to protect other GM crops that are exported from Canada to Mexico. In fact, Canada exports very little of any genetically modified crop to Mexico, but certainly Canada has argued, of course, that they want to see the trade rules implemented in the way that they argue, such that, you know, in this case, they're specific to Mexico, but in statements they've made, you know, it's about the future of the biotechnology. We would say the preoccupation is with the industry, but the future is making sure that Canadian exports are free to move around the world, that biotechnology is not under scrutiny such that other countries would not choose to also restrict genetically modified organisms. So there's no immediate and specific impact on the Canadian economy, but there's a projection into the future about the impact this could have on not even, you know, we don't even actually produce a lot of different types of genetically engineered crops, but the Canadian government's been very specific about wanting to actually protect the future of the biotechnology industry writ large, that they would like to see this innovation continue, and they would like Canadian farmers to have access to the tools. And they specifically argue that if Mexico restricts GM corn in Mexico, that this means there's disharmony between Canada, the US, and Mexico, and that because contamination is a very real concern, whether with GM corn or other crops, that developers of GM products would like to see every market open to those products so that there is no risk of trade disruption when there is contamination. So there's actually this explicit concern about contamination. Thanks.
We have a lot of good questions here, and I want to maybe keep to this theme for one more question, because I think it's a really important point that this case technically is about Mexico, and corn. And in fact, you could say it's maybe even really only about white corn, which is a tiny part of US exports. Really what it's about is countries' ability to make these kinds of decisions. And it could apply in many other agreements. There's the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework Agreement that's being negotiated now. There is an agreement being negotiated with Kenya. We don't know exactly what's in the text of the sections on agriculture. We do know in both of those cases, there is a chapter on agriculture that is in the trade part, which is the binding part. And USTR has said it will deal with biotechnology. So one of the innovations in USMCA was a specific section on facilitating approval of agricultural biotechnology. This is something new. Now, in the end, I think as a result of the negotiations, that clause didn't require acceptance. It only required that there be a process. So the focus is on the SPS issues. But I think this does have really strong implications in other countries for other products. And I think that's why for us, of course, we care about corn in Mexico, but we also care about food sovereignty, about the fact that this will have implications in so many other countries. So I will just get off my soapbox there and go on to some of the other questions back on the decision making, some of which are related. So we have a question from Joss Wilson, which so he wonders if Mexico or people in the US would talk about new biotech rules for climate change solutions, such as gene editing, and why do they not say GMO corn and not the new biotechnology that is being decided now by APHIS? I wonder if that's something Bill could address, the APHIS rules and how they might apply in this case.
Yeah, just for everyone's understanding, APHIS is the Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service. It's a division of USDA that for some reason was assigned the responsibility for GMO regulation. And I think what Josh is referring to is USDA in 2020 put out a new biotechnology regulatory rule, a new framework. And it's basically a deregulatory initiative. So, you know, basically USDA APHIS used to require companies to get a permit if they wanted to field test a new experimental GMO. And the permits required at least some sort of isolation measures like buffer zones to try and prevent that experimental GMO from contaminating, you know, commercial crops. So, but what we've seen in 2020 is USDA just basically exempting a lot of GMOs, both traditional genetic engineering that involves introducing a new gene to create a new protein, and the newer techniques, gene editing, from regulation altogether. And I think it really serves us better to talk about GMOs in this broad sense. They include both the traditional GMOs, genetic that we often call genetic engineering or modification, and gene editing. So I would also not talk about climate change very much. The industry, the biotech industry is always searching for attractive sounding reasons to accept GMOs. They're going to save the world in one way or another, right? That's what we've been told since the 1990s. You know, early on, increased yields, better nutrition, drought resistance, on and on. They've always made attractive sounding claims. And today it's climate change. We're going to create GMOs that will solve the climate crisis. Don't believe it, okay? It's nonsense. It's not true. What we have are crops that increase herbicide use and resistance. And, then the insect resistant crops that have more and more toxins in them. So I guess that's the main thing. The US has, kind of reached a point now where they're deregulating GMOs as much as possible. but they still want to give the illusion to Mexico and the rest of the world, right, that these crops are tightly regulated, and we can be assured that they're safe, right? But don't believe it. It's not true. The whole regulatory system in the US is basically, I know this is strong, but it's basically a sham. It's designed to promote acceptance of GMOs domestically and internationally, not to ensure food safety or environmental safety.
Were there others who wanted to address that one? All right. We have a couple of questions related to the process and how we can get the word out. One, I think, is that maybe Lucy already answered in part, but from Mary McPherson, Canada submitted testimony supporting the US position, and Canadian NGOs are not permitted to submit testimony. Could the municipal governments that have banned glyphosate, such as in Montreal and Quebec City, present the information on this webinar as municipal governments, or at least get the word out publicly? Or has this already happened? Similarly, so there's different thinking about what should be a next step. Has the process worked so far? What could come next? Lucy, do you know about okay, great. So Lucy and then Chuck.
I'll allow for Chuck to go ahead first if you want to, Charles.
So the US has filed its response to the lengthy and science-heavy Mexican submission. We're all waiting for the official Spanish translation of the US response before it's released in both English and Spanish. I think a careful read and analysis of the US response will really lay out how this debate is going to unfold, and both the position and the information and science that the US government is going to try to place in front of the tribunal. The US government's submission, for those of you that haven't read it, it basically just was full of platitudes about how wonderful GMO crops are and how they've caused no harm in the 30 years that they've been on the market, that no Americans have suffered any adverse health effects. All the animals that consume GM crops as a significant part of their feed have performed just fine, and they just they present the position that it's just utterly unjustified to even question the safety of the BT and VIP proteins, for example. That they will argue that it doesn't matter that people in Mexico are going to be exposed to 50 times higher levels of these endotoxins in their tortillas and tostadas than what they would have been in the first generation, because they're totally safe. So if the US government only does a more articulate job of presenting the platitudes and oh, isn't it obvious? It's been proven that everyone agrees. Mexico and other countries have approved these technologies. If that's all they do, then it's a pretty clear evidence that they cannot cite science that rebuts or undermines the relevance in the Mexican context of the science in our various comments. So I think a close and careful read of that and some discussion about how to respond to it is an important next step.
Lucy, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, the context for the Mexican restrictions is the decades of concern and opposition from farmers in Mexico, indigenous communities, and consumers around various concerns. And there's momentum in Canada and the US around people's concern about pesticide exposure, in particular, the use of glyphosate. And I do think, though, this dispute panel process is restricted to those who are given leave to submit. As Charles has said, we actually, through the access to these documents, have access to be able to really have a look and see which arguments are being used and which of them are actually robust. And the Mexican submission has provided a lot of the information in the scientific literature that's worth looking at. But there is also still a role for the public to be a part of supporting, in solidarity with people in Mexico and the decision of the Mexican government. And so we do have an action in Canada, for example, where individuals can sign a petition. And so there's still work that can be done in the surrounding context also, I think, to support the future of making sure that democratic decisions and decisions for public health are not undermined by trade agreements in this way.
Thank you. I think we'll move on to concluding comments now. I'd like to give each panelist perhaps 2 minutes each to make some concluding comments. And I will start with Javier.
Thank you. So I just like to conclude by thank you for organizing this webinar, and thank you to the other panelists for your support in this struggle. I think this is really a worthwhile struggle because the ramifications go way beyond GMO corn and Mexico itself. Well, what is most important for the tribunal is the evidence. So we invite everybody to dive into the legal arguments and the evidence that we as civil society have provided, because the more informed we are, the more we can really shape the public debate and counteract the lies of the GMO and biotech industry. Thank you very much.
It really is an honor to hear all of you. I'd like to go on next to Chuck.
Thank you, Karen, and I too, I've really appreciated the opportunity to engage in this debate. Bill and I are among a few still active professionals that were heavily involved in the debate in the 90s when these technologies first were brought onto the market. So we lived through the arguments and the science that was on the table, and back then these technologies were not tested for food safety adequately, and they haven't been since. And it's incredibly perplexing to me to understand how the U.S. government and political leaders in the United States would allow such a massive experiment to be undertaken in the United States. Now, I think part of the answer to that question is that GM corn does not play a significant role in the U.S. diet. GM corn, most of it goes to produce ethanol, animal feed, high fructose corn syrup, and corn oil. And none of those primary uses result in the presence of BT and VIP proteins in food that Americans eat. So it's no surprise that there would be no epidemiological evidence in the United States of adverse health impacts. But Mexico, it's very different. Corn, as I said, makes up 60% of the diet. So it's a completely different context for the assessment of the safety of these technologies. And for the U.S. government to try to impose the U.S. experience on Mexico as adequately covering the unique concerns in Mexico, it's just irresponsible, and the tribunal needs to call them on it. One last point, U.S. agriculture in general is reeling right now. Market prices are going down. Leaders throughout the agricultural system are putting all sorts of pressure on the US government to become more aggressive in the trade arena, because in the US, the solution to low crop prices is always expanding exports. So there's a lot of politics driving the aggressive stance that the US is taking in this particular dispute. And I think our colleagues in Mexico need to be aware of that, and people need to watch how that unfolds.
Thank you. Lucy?
Well, I think that there's a lot of science inside the submissions that we can dig into, and where there is this ongoing investigation, ongoing non-consensus, we can see that that's the independent science that has emerged that tells us that there are risk indicators has emerged despite the best efforts of an enclosure of science to private interests. So even with the little amount of resources and space that's given to independent science, we have some available. And as Javier says, this is really important at this time because we have other genetically modified crops and foods that will be coming, and we need to understand now what the impacts of GM corn are, but more importantly, to recognize that different foods and crops have cultural and economic and environmental significance that goes beyond, in this case, for example, how Canada and the US understand the issues. They're not recognizing the significance. They're not interested in recognizing the significance of corn for people in Mexico. Similarly, there's no real discussion in Canada and the US about the future of food, what it really means when actually the structures are created to facilitate the biotechnology industry's success.
Thank you. Bill?
Yeah, I thank you also, Karen and IATP, for holding this webinar. And yeah, I guess, I don't know, I think what I would conclude by saying is it kind of comes from talking with a Mexican journalist a few days ago. And after we were discussing some of the specific issues that we've all dealt with in this webinar, he kind of came down on this idea that Mexico feels in a certain sense like there's no alternative. We have to pursue modern agriculture like the US, and that there's just so much momentum behind it. And US agriculture is so productive that there's really no other way. And so, I tried to show him, that there is quite a bit of momentum for more sustainable, agriculture in the US. Organic, for instance, is thriving. It could be doing better, but it's still a major force. You just don't hear much about it. And I think that this prejudice that modern agriculture that uses, tons of pesticides and fertilizers and GMOs is progress and inevitable, I think that is, really kind of one of the biggest obstacles we face. So, in fact, what we see is that if you're a small farmer in the US, or you're doing something a little bit different out of the mainstream, you're going to be under threat. All right. And I gave the example already of this biofuels corn, right? Because of the contamination that's occurring, white corn growers in Nebraska they feel like they might have to go out of business. It's just that serious of a problem. And similarly, with some of the newer GMOs that are herbicide resistant, Chuck mentioned this, they're resistant to herbicides that when they're sprayed, they drift and cause damage miles away from the treated field. And so, if you're trying to grow fruits or vegetables in the Midwest in the US, you're experiencing a lot of damage, so, I guess what I'm trying to say is that US agriculture is, it's very productive, but it's a real mess in a lot of ways. It's really damaging to a lot of farmers who aren't following the mainstream path of GMOs and intensive pesticide use. And it's really not a path that Mexico I don't think should want to follow. And that goes for a lot of other countries too.
Thank you. We are at time, and I want to respect people's time. As you may have been seeing in the chat, we will be circulating the recordings and the PowerPoints that we have within a week to everybody who registered for this webinar. Also, I want to thank Cassandra Smithies, our interpreter, as well as Cecilia and Lily, our technical support for this webinar, who kept things running so nicely. Next Thursday, May 2nd, we'll have the next in this series of webinars, this one on biodiversity and cultural rights implications, not only of the issue, but what's actually in the USMCA text that should provide an additional defense, some important language on what this implies. And then on May 7th, one on the economics, countering the assertion that there is no alternative, and what this means for farmers' livelihoods and perspectives in the 3 countries. Thank you very much to everyone, and I hope I'll see you next Thursday. Bye.